Good morning. How are we today? Well, I hope you guys are doing all right. All right. So, we are continuing with our discussion of miracles today, and we're going to be focusing on critiques, right? Arguments against either believing that miracles have occurred or in believing that even if something miraculous may have occurred, that it may not be evidence for God, right? Which is definitely what we're going to see at first from Christine Overall, right? So we're going to focus on Overall, Hume, and J.L. Mackie today. But any questions before we get started? Anything that we've discussed so far? Again, we're continuing our discussion of arguments for God's existence. How are we doing on the paper? I know I'm behind on grading, so you haven't been getting my feedback, but hopefully you're getting some decent feedback from your peers. No, all right, that's all right. That's what drafts are for. We got the whole quarter, whole quarter to work it out. All right, so continuing then. If you're following along, I was realizing that I do not have overall slides in here. I have like just her intro. So I'm going to add those later. I'm leaving a little note for myself. But slide 17 for our miracles PowerPoint is just her bio. So right, she's one of the few female philosophers of religion that gets acknowledged within the literature. And again, it's interesting because she's taking specifically a feminist critique approach, right? So for those of you who are unfamiliar, there's a lot to be said about feminism, right? But on the whole, yes, it has not been perfect. Yes, it has been very white. Yes, it has been very privileged. But its efforts in the realm of philosophy have been to go back through the history of ideas and try to figure out if one, the people who are responsible for those theories, if they themselves held any biases, right? Whether sexist, racist, xenophobic, right, whatever it might have been, homophobic. And then if they did, then to check their work and see if those biases infiltrated the work itself, right? And this ends up, unfortunately, having been the case for a lot of the historical figures, right? When we look at their actual ideas, they tend to imply things that justify that sort of discrimination, right? And so the idea then for feminist philosophers has been to go back and try to fix those theories, right? Okay, how can we revise this work so that it does no longer implies that bias, or if that can't be done, what a framework do we need to switch to, right? Such that those problematic views will no longer occur. So to give you a classic example of this, someone who is a very famous philosopher, his name is Immanuel Kant, and he is who we get a very famous theory of ethics from. There's a Kantian deontology, right? It's named after him. And so in this theory of ethics, right, one of the core aspects is that reason and emotion are at odds with each other, right? That if you're going to make a moral decision, you need to use reason to justify that moral decision, not emotion, right? That emotion will lead us to biases, right? Will lead us to act irrationally, will make us do the wrong thing, right? And unfortunately, when you look back at the history of Kant's life, it turns out that he didn't always think this. He didn't always think that reason and emotion were at odds with each other. He used to think that emotion played a really important role in ethical decision making, but then he fell in love with a woman and she rebuffed him when he proposed, and he was devastated. And he went into isolation for 10 years. And when he reemerged, all of a sudden, emotion should no longer play a role in making decision. And when you look at it from that context, you're like, well, gee, that makes a lot of sense, right? He had this horrible experience because he made a decision based on emotion. It bit him in the ass. And so now he's saying we should not make decisions like that ever, right? And so one might, want to take that then motivation, that reality of motivation, may want to take his theory with a grain of salt, right? Or try to revise the theory in light of that. Especially because it has had some really intense implications in terms of misogyny, right? A lot of people treat women as poor decision makers because we assume that women are inherently more emotional, right? So we still sort of do make those same associations that Kant was talking about. We associate emotionality with irrationality, right? And so a feminist philosophy of religion is going to be taking those types of things into consideration, right? What are the implications of these views on how we actually practice and live our everyday lives, right? Is it going to mean that some people are treated unfairly, unjustly, right? So that's what it means to look at any approach or theory from a feminist perspective, right? What are the values that are driving that theory? Did those values create problematic implications, right, if we accept that theory? Okay. So with all of that, right, Christine overall is going to be talking about miracles not only as not being sufficient evidence for God, but she takes this really radical claim where she says, if miracles actually occur, that should count as evidence against God. Right? So she's making a really radical critique here, right? That not only are miracles insufficient evidence to establish the existence of God, right? But that even if we can establish that a miracle has occurred, that should give us reason to think that there is no God, or at least not the type of God typically proposed to exist in the Abrahamic traditions. Okay, so she's going to give us a number of different reasons for this. Again, I'm sorry they're not in the PowerPoint, but I'm going to be adding them. The first one is that a miracle would constitute certain types of evil if we understand it in the strong sense, right? And who can remember what a strong sense of a miracle is again from Tuesday? Relating what?
The like natural.
Natural. We're missing a word there, laws. The laws
Oh,
of nature, yes, right? The laws, the rules that govern everything in the universe. Absolutely. Right. And so the strong sense of a miracle is a violation of those laws, right? So the law says that something has to happen, right? And so a miracle would be that thing not happening when it should happen, right? So violating the law. So why would she think that it might be a form of evil, right? A violation of natural law or a permanently inexplicable event. Right? Because remember, these, according to Swinburne, it's also a non-repeatable instance, right? That's what makes it a miracle. Because again, if we were breaking the laws all the time, the laws aren't really the laws. We have to revise the laws. So these are rare things, non-repeatable, or as she says, permanently inexplicable in terms of natural explanation, right? We can't explain it other than God. Okay, so if this is truly something that happens, she says this is a type of evil. Either it's a metaphysical evil, right, in that it's a flaw in the system, meaning that God made laws that could be broken, right? So there's potentially a metaphysical issue in terms of God's power to create this goodness and this regularity of law in the universe, right? This order, this predictability that is so useful, right? That it's sort of weird that as an afterthought, right, that God could just decide to break those rules. So it could potentially be a metaphysical evil. She also thinks, though, and I think this one's a little more interesting, that it's a cognitive evil, right? That again, if there is a God, this God made us with the capacity to reason and such intelligence that we are trying to understand the laws of nature, right? We're trying to understand how our universe operates. And so if that's the case, why would that God then break those laws? Like, wouldn't that just confuse us? It's almost like sadistic. Like these people are trying to figure, it'd be like if, okay, so as part of, your final grade for this class, you have to figure out my grading system, and I never tell you what it is, right? And then halfway through the quarter, you guys think you figured it out, and then I just break my own rule, right? And I do something else. That's going to throw everybody off, right? It's going to add a thing that is going to derail you from answering those questions. So it could also be just an epistemic or cognitive evil. But then it also could just be, she thinks, a simple moral evil, that maybe this is some sort of not sadistic, but at least capricious act on the part of God, right? That God made these laws, but it doesn't matter. God can break them whenever God wants, right? Again, there might be some sort of potential flaw in God's moral compass if we see violations of laws of nature in this way. Right? So those are some potential views. But what if those are not compelling, right? If you don't think that miracles are any sort of evil, then she has some other potential views. She says, well, it could just be that miracles are incompatible with a perfect God. Because remember, back to the ontological argument, the simplest way of understanding what most people understand to be God is a most perfect being, right? And again, it seems odd that a perfectly good, perfectly informed, and perfectly talented God, right, would then just undo whatever decision they had made before. Because if they had to undo it, then maybe it wasn't perfect in the first place, right? So again, there's a potential threat here to God's perfection that it might be incompatible with. The third one is that it tends to make God an outsider, right? Outside of the laws of nature, which again, if you're a deist or something like that, that might not be problematic. But for her, for traditional Christian monotheists, right, who want a personal God, right, the idea is that for God to intervene in this way, right, God needs to be outside of the laws that they are violating, right? Otherwise, they're like changing themselves while they're in the system. Or finally, you could just think that it's not fair, right? If God performs miracles, well, there seems to be a clear case of inequity in terms of who gets the miracles and who doesn't get the miracles, right? So here again, we might have some sort of mark against God's moral character here, right? If not that it is an act of moral evil, that it's at least not fair, right? Who gets miracles bestowed upon them and who doesn't, right? Again, this is leading us into our conversation next week, the problem of evil, right? Why do good things happen to bad people, right? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? Who decides who gets the miracles? And again, that can lead to some really, effed up views in certain religious traditions. There's one I'm going to be talking about in my other class later this term when we talk about Christianity, and that is the prosperity gospel, right? The idea that if good things happen to you, if you're wealthy, that's a direct result of God's love. So if you're poor, that just means that you did something to piss God off, right? Like it's just a justification for that inequity, right? And so we might say that if we're looking for some true notion of justice or fairness, that we would want an explanation for why miracles again occur for some people and not others, right? Okay. So any questions about Christine Overall's critiques? Right? So the idea is that it's not really going to give us the kind of God that most people are going to think, right? Most people associate miracles again with a loving God, right? One who's intervening on our behalf, whereas she's pointing out all the potential negative consequences of such intervention. What do we think? Can any of you think of something that would be considered a miraculous intervention, but that might be considered evil from some other perspective? I guess it could be like, you know, again, if we're thinking like in the weak sense of miracle, we could say, oh, well, some really terrible person is higher up on a transplant list, right, than somebody else, or there's something that bumps a really terrible person up the list, and before a really wonderful person was going to get that organ, and now it gets taken and someone else survives. That seems plausible, right? Rich people. No, and you'll notice this is really imperative when we get to the problem of evil next week, is that all of the examples that are going to be used when we talk about the problem of evil involve children, right? Because there's something in terms of our intuition where when bad things happen to adults, we can okay, maybe they deserve it, right? Or they lived long enough. But there's something about the innocence of children, right? Where it doesn't matter how utilitarian the outcome is, there's still some heart-wrenching thing, right, where we don't necessarily automatically agree that it's appropriate to sacrifice, right, or that it would be the right thing or the good thing to do, right, to sacrifice an innocent child, even if it were for the greater good. right? And so that
Yeah.
intuition, you guys are going to have to, again, it's for you to decide, like, what level of benefit would you need to get for that to be the right thing to do, right? Because that's going to hinge upon whether or not you think responses to the problem of evil are successful, right? Because a lot of them are going to say, well, it's part of God's plan, right? These were necessary evils, even if we can't exactly see that. But then you go, but the children, why the children, right? Like that just seems so unnecessary. Exactly, right? And that has some really interesting implications now. Like, we're actually intervening in evolution a little bit because, like you pointed out, like historically, prior to certain types of technological advancements, like cesarean type procedures, a lot of women, if your pelvic bone was too narrow, you died during childbirth, right? Like that's just what happened until we started enacting this cesarean procedure, right? And now what's interesting is that a lot more people need cesarean procedures because people with narrower hip bones are reproducing more, right? That wasn't the case before. And so we've necessitated this procedure in the future for more people, right? Because we saved certain individuals. And so all of this thing about like, yeah, why then? Why did that intervention not come for people before, right? I'm sure people probably on the cusp of other types of cures for diseases, right? Think these types of things as well, like the timing of all of it. But again, yeah, like why this person and not another person? There doesn't seem to be a clearly just answer, right, for those types of things. And it is imperative, again, when talking about miracles, right? Why did God perform a miracle for this individual in this particular circumstance rather than a different individual, right? Okay. All right. So now moving on to David Hume. Okay. So any more thoughts or questions about overall before we continue? Okay. So David Hume, right, remember, is our resident skeptic, right? Radical empiricist, which means that for him, the only things we can know come from experience. And what are the only things we've experienced? The past and the present, right? So what that means for him are some pretty important things in terms of things like even claiming there are such things as laws of nature, right? Because a law of nature is supposed to be an absolute truth that dictates what happens in the future. But if you're Hume, you don't think we can have knowledge of the future, right? So laws of nature already are sort of not something we can really be aware of. So how is he going to approach this question of being justified in believing a miracle has occurred, right? Well, again, he's not going to base it on being able to tell if a law has been violated, right? That's what Swinburne tried to do, right? This is not going to be like that, right? He's not going to require us to prove that a law has been broken for the very reason that, again, he doesn't think we can have knowledge of laws of nature. So he's going to be giving us different reasons, what we might consider more epistemological reasons to reject, right? Even if you think you have experienced a miracle, right? What should your belief about that experience be, right? So I always use this stupid example, like George Clooney's floating outside my house, right? Like that's a violation of a law of nature. I see this thing, right? What should my attitude towards my own experience be, right? And so that's what Hume is going to focus on. And I already talked about this a little bit, but we're going to dive in more deeply today, right? And he's going to basically say a couple of things. One, again, that we should proportion our belief to the evidence, right? So when I'm figuring out how to approach my belief about seeing George Clooney floating outside, I need to compare that not just to the evidence in that instance, but also to all the other evidence I've developed in the past, right? Because that's also part of my knowledge base, right? Present and past. What is my experience in the past about people floating, right? And so when I proportion my belief to all of my experience, not just the present, but all of my past knowledge as well, well, then the likelihood that what I saw in the present actually occurred becomes very, very small, right? And so my confidence level that that is actually what I saw should be very, very small, right? And that's all it is, right? We are figuring out how confident we should be in supposedly witnessing a particular type of miraculous phenomenon. Okay, so again, just to cover a little bit, I have in here slides 21 and 22 about his metaphysics, right? The inevitable source of uncertainty and error, the justest and most plausible objection against a considerable part of metaphysics, that they are not properly a science, right? Because again, he thinks laws of nature go beyond the evidence, right? And science shouldn't go beyond the evidence into the future. We can't claim to know what's going to happen in the future. Instead, these theories arise from the fruitless efforts of human vanity, right? He thinks it's very vain and ignorant to claim that, well, we know what's going to happen in the future, which would penetrate into subjects utterly inaccessible to the understanding, or from the craft of popular superstitions, which being unable to defend themselves on fair ground, raise these entangling branches to cover and protect their weakness, right? So what he's saying is that since they can't actually prove that something is going to happen in the future, they craft these superstitions or super complex models of what's going on to explain it. Like we were just sort of taught, right? It's part of a bigger plan we just can't understand, right? With our puny human brains, right? And for him, that's unacceptable, right? That is not a sufficient response to the critique. So again, instead, he's going to be looking at what should we believe about our experiences if we cannot use just argumentation to ensure that they've occurred. Okay, so again, can we ever be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred? Swinburne said yes, right, as long as, right, it was a violation of the law of nature in a non-repeatable counter instance. And also what? Who can remember what Swinburne also required for us to believe in miracles? What else do you need? Yes, and on purpose by whom? Has to have been clearly for a reason, right? And for the reason being something that a divine being, right, obviously was motivated to do. We may not necessarily know what the reason is, right? But that some sort of intent or direction or again, intelligent design was at play in that instance. Good. Okay, so if you satisfy those two criterion for Swinburne, yes, you can be justified in believing in miracles. For Hume, again, he is going to give us a list of criterias that you would need to meet, but because of two truths, he says we're never going to be able to meet these criteria, right? So he sets one, but it's impossible to meet for two particular reasons. This is on slide 23, right? We cannot justify belief in miracles on either our own experience or on the testimony of others. Because if you remember, that was Swinburne's two things, right? On the principle of credulity, we can trust our own experience, and on the principle of testimony, we can trust other people relaying their own experiences. But for Hume, when it comes to both of those things, we're never going to be able to meet the threshold to justify rational belief, right? So I mentioned the first one already, right? Why we can't justify our own personal experience, right? And then we're going to talk about the reasons why we can't justify the testimony of others. But one thing, again, is going to be the comparison of your experience to the experience of others, right? So if we remember, the principle of testimony is important because most of what we know about the world comes from the testimony of others. Most of us are not experts in physics and all of the different sciences, right? And so even though we have, some level of understanding of like Einstein's relativity, I know it's E equals mc squared, and right, I know certain, Pythagorean theorems and things like this. Like, obviously, I don't know how to prove those in the way that like a mathematician would, right? Or something like this. So there's a level of understanding that I'm counting on from the experts, right, in order to justify my belief. But let's say it turns out that some mathematician down the line comes out and says, oh man, you guys, we way got it wrong. Pythagorean theorem is false, right? They've found some counter instance, right? Then maybe we change our beliefs, right? We change our scientific theories. We talked about all this before. So again, most of what we think we know about the world comes from the testimony of others. So one thing that Hume is going to focus on is how we weigh that testimony of others against, again, our experience. So when we're just judging our own experience, we're weighing the present against the past. When it comes to the testimony of others, we're weighing all of our experience against the testimony of others, right? So there's always going to be a comparison here. so that we can, again, proportion our belief to the evidence. Okay, so again, that's the principle of rationality as stated on slide 24. So how can we then turn this, right, this idea into an argument? I've laid it out here in standard form for you. We could say Hume's argument goes something like this. Sense perception is better evidence than testimony. Now, why would he think that? Why is your sensory experience or perception of something better evidence than testimony? Good, right? So there's an immediacy to the truth for us, right? That is lacking when we are basing our belief off the testimony of others, right? Because we haven't necessarily been able to maybe do like some of the quick thinking things that we do on the fly. Like, have you ever seen maybe something out of the corner of your eye and like, what was that? And your brain does all these like, you know, quick thinking, like process of elimination type things, right? That's happening on the spot. We don't know if the person we're talking to did all those things, right? Did they consider all these possibilities, right? Did they do their due diligence before they arrived at this conclusion? So yeah, there's an immediacy with which we have personal sense perception such that we tend to be more reliable if we're being honest with ourselves. Of course, we can lie to ourselves, but on the whole, right, the idea is that your sense perception of something is going to be more accurate than someone else relaying it to you. And I think, again, another good example of why this is the case is also language, right? So even if someone is relaying to you a complete truth, the knowledge that you're able to garner from their testimony is going to be limited by the language that they use to explain it and the language that you understand to receive it, right? So, right, someone could explain something in a really complex way and you don't understand it at all, right? Versus someone explaining it to it in a simpler way and then you do understand it. Maybe you've tried to explain like a dream to someone before and you just can't put the sensations, right, what it is, you can't put it into words, right? So there's some things that maybe just can't even be captured, right, by language. So there are these barriers to testimony that do not happen with our own immediate sense perception. So when they conflict, when our experience conflicts with what someone else has told you, what do you think Hume is going to say you should side with? Because of that simple truth that your experience is more reliable, right, than the testimony of others, if they conflict, you should trust your experience. Okay, now, again, that doesn't mean that we're always going to end up being right, right? But the idea is that maybe if you experience being wrong enough, then that's new evidence in your arsenal, right, to update your belief down the line. So again, this is maybe something with kids, like telling kids about something like, oh, do you know that there are black swans? There aren't any black swans. Swans are only white, right? Like that's a truth for them. They just haven't experienced enough variety in the animal kingdom yet, right? To see that there are animals of all different colors, right? So again, what is clearly true to us based on our experience changes, right? So that's not going to necessarily give us truth, just trusting your experience over the testimony of others, right? We're not perfect. But the idea is that given the reliability of each of those, right, when they conflict, you ought to select your experience. And hopefully your experience will be broad enough and diverse enough to capture more truths in the world. Okay, so according to Hume, then, our individual sense perception favors the laws of nature and not miracles, right? So again, he's not saying we can have absolute knowledge of laws of nature, but our experience favors those being more likely to be true than the occurrence of miracles. And this is especially because he thinks miracles have not historically been experienced by people personally. Miracles are told through testimony in scripture. And so again, if we just are following from the reasoning before, you should always prioritize your experience over the testimony of others, even if that testimony isn't a sacred text. Okay, so because of this, he thinks we are never justified in believing that a miracle has occurred. Okay, so in the case of miracles, our evidence in favor, right, of miracles almost always comes from the testimony of others. Notably, eyewitness accounts But those are difficult to document historically, right? And eyewitness accounts are not always consistent depending on who the witness was, right? Again, if you've watched Law and Order or something like this, you've probably heard this. Like there are as many versions to a story as there are pairs of eyes, right? You could have 10 people watch the same thing and they'll all give you different accounts of what happened, right? The car was a different color, the person was a different color, a different height. Like we all see very, very different things. And again, maybe you've even done some of these psychology experiments. Have any of you seen the gorilla basketball one? Where they ask you to watch a video and count how many times the basketball is being passed, right? And if you're focused on the task, most people don't even observe a gorilla walking through, right? Like our brains are really selective in what they observe. So again, our sense perception, even at that moment, is not always accurate, right? So again, getting eyewitness accounts to coincide and be consistent is very difficult. So our evidence against miracles, right, comes again from our experience. So for Hume, the testimony in favor would have to be more forceful than the laws of nature that contradict it. Okay, so what would that require, right? Because again, he's not being so arrogant to say that we're always right, right? So what would need to be the case for us to believe that a law of nature has been broken, even if our experience didn't tell us that? And so this is slide 26. He's going to give us a set of criteria here, right? Necessary and sufficient conditions for rationally believing in a miracle based on other people's testimony. So first, there have to be a sufficient number of witnesses of one, good sense, right? They have to understand what they're seeing. Okay, so yeah, if you have a bunch of kids watching like a magic show, and they all give you the same testimony of what happened, that doesn't necessarily mean, right, that what they witnessed was as they described, because they maybe don't understand enough about the way illusory magic works, right? Tricks of the hand, right? So they don't have enough understanding to properly assess what they're seeing. Okay, so they have to have enough good sense. You have to have a good education, again, preferably to understand something about science and the laws of nature that are supposedly being violated. Again, we used the apocalypto example, right? Of course, you're going to think that a miracle has occurred during a solar eclipse if you don't understand, right, certain things about orbital patterns. The next thing is, of course, integrity. You have to be able to trust these eyewitnesses, right? We have to be able to believe what they're telling us, which means that we should be able to judge them based on their reputation, right? Have they been truthful in the past, right? Do they have a history of giving accurate testimony? Okay, and then finally, they need to have observed this event in public, right? Not in a situation, again, where someone could be controlling the outcome, right? Manipulating the experience. There are even some cool places in California that are like full of optical illusions where like balls seem to roll uphill, right? And all these things. But the idea there is that you're not in an environment conducive to seeing things as they actually are, right? You're in an environment that is made to trick the eye. And so again, we want to make sure that it is a public space, but for him, that means not able to be tricked, right? Not able to be interfered with by someone who's trying to confuse you into something else. All right, so according to Hume then, absolutely no testimony in the history of humanity, any testimony of a miracle meets this criteria, right? He thinks there has never been a record of a miracle where there has been a sufficient number of witnesses that meet these requirements, right? They either didn't have a proper understanding, didn't have a sufficient scientific understanding, didn't have the correct motivations, right? Or intent, or were potentially tricked, okay? So nothing for him is going to meet that criteria. Remember, I told you Swinburne thinks that's far too high a criteria, right? According to him, if you think that if you can only get knowledge from testimony based on this, then we can't know anything. So think about what knowledge you gain from testimony of others. Does it meet this criteria? If it doesn't, does that mean you should reject it? Right? That's very difficult. So one of the other things I think I mentioned that I really liked about Hume's account is this disease of the ears, right? So this goes again to his influence in psychology, why he thinks we like to hear these stories, right? So he thinks human nature is to greedily listen to and tell marvelous and extraordinary stories. And as a result, we have a tendency to believe in those stories. And he thinks that these tendencies actually override our inclination for rational judgment, right? Like, have you ever heard a story so cool and you're like, that's probably not true, but I just want to think it is, right? Like, I hope it's true. It would be so awesome if it was true, right? That's the sort of intuition or inclination he thinks we have towards truth, right? And towards stories. So he thinks also, though, what is really fascinating is that people who tend to believe in miracles also tend to be a little inconsistent about their willingness to believe in them, right? So what that means is that people who tend to believe in the miraculous are inclined to believe in the testimony purported by scripture, but are maybe less inclined to believe that such things are possible now. So he says that those who are inclined to believe in miracles almost treat the events of these miraculous stories as having occurred in a world that played by different rules than we know now, right? Like, so if you came to a Christian and said, I just saw someone part the Red Sea, they're not going to believe you, even though they think that this has happened before, right? Or that someone was capable of doing this, right? They're not going to believe that. Or if, right, someone came and said they were talking to God in a burning bush nowadays, right? I don't think most people, even if they're religious, would treat them as a prophet. They're probably going to want to put them in a padded room, right? Like, we just don't treat people's testimony of the miraculous all the time now as if it's as plausible as the miracles that occurred in biblical stories, right? And religious scripture. And so this other inconsistency, he thinks, like, why was it possible? Why were all these miracles like happening in scripture all the time and now we don't see any? Like, again, they needn't be repeatable, but it's not like we're seeing different types of miracles either, right? So why were miracles like so prevalent at some point? He thinks maybe it's just we're again inclined to this exaggeration. We're inclined to hyperbole. Maybe we're even inclined to lie a little bit, right? To fib here and there. Again, especially in terms of stories meaning to or being meant to express some sort of moral, right? So maybe the stories of miraculous events were merely just to teach us something about right and wrong. I mean, you guys know about like the German origins of our Disney fairy tales, right? Like, none of them had happy endings. They all ended with the children dying, right? Because they were all meant to scare children into doing safe things, right? And so we might think that maybe, right, Hume is sort of seeing the stories of the miraculous could possibly be viewed in the same way. All right. Unfortunately, Hume's racism comes in a little bit at the end here when he is talking about how none of the stories of the miraculous come from reliable people. He uses words like barbarous and ignorant, and he really means non-white people, which is really problematic. So that is definitely something to take into consideration. But again, you might think, what would be sufficient evidence to believe that a miracle had occurred even in the past, right? What would we need to know about the people who gave that testimony? All right, and so that leads us into J.L. Mackie, who's going to continue this question, right, about miracles and testimony. Okay, so again, how is it going to affect the confidence level that we give something? Right. And so Hume ends the first part by allowing the possibility, again, that maybe something could meet that criteria. Maybe it just hasn't yet. Right. But even though, again, he thinks if they're equally balanced, you should still probably lean towards, right, doubting that that thing has occurred based on your past experience. Okay. So Mackie then is going to say that it's not logically impossible that miracles ever happen, right? He's going to say maybe we just can't know. So he's switching gears where Hume went saying, like, well, look, we can't prove that a law of nature has been violated. Let's just talk about whether or not it's justifiable to believe in it. Here, Mackie's saying, well, these things might be happening all the time, and our ability to be aware of them may not correlate, right, to the evidence that Hume is seeking. Okay, so just highlighting some potential approaches, right, to this problem. Remember, though, that this argument was never meant to give, again, deductive or definitive proof for God's existence. And that is because, again, arguments based on miracles rest on inference to the best explanation, right? So again, this is a type of inductive reasoning. It only ever says how likely something is to be true, right? So if you have an experience that just seems so unlikely, right? Hume is going to say, well, it probably is. Even if you can't come up with any other good explanation, natural explanation, like maybe you think it has to be aliens, or it has to be ghosts, or it has to be God, or it has to be something supernatural, right? He thinks, nope, your history of experience of non-miracles, right, means that you should just doubt that you had, right? You were just probably mistaken. It couldn't have been what you thought you saw. So, last few minutes here, I want you to think about it. Maybe some people can even be willing to share if they've been thinking about it already. What would it take for you to believe you saw something miraculous? If you saw someone floating in front of you, right, like levitating, what is your inference? What sort of process would you go through? What are some of the things that you would try to eliminate before you arrive at the conclusion that this is a miraculous event? Hidden structures, right, holding them up, right? So even if you eliminate the possibility of it being an illusion in terms of like machinery and, actual setup, that doesn't necessarily mean that you still aren't hallucinating for some reason, right? That your eyes and brain are playing tricks on you for some way. And then, yeah, how would you go about proving that none of that's the case? Because even if you did go to get a blood test, maybe it was something that was in your system for just a short period of time and now it's not, right? Like not everything remains in your system long enough to be tested. This is also, again, it brings up some very basic questions in philosophy and in epistemology about how can we know that what we're seeing is real, right? How can we know that it tracks what's in real life? Like, have you ever had, I know we know about color blindness and things now, but have you ever had like such a staunch disagreement with someone about what color something is? You're like, how are we looking at the same thing? Right. But then we also learn again about tricks like with that blue black dress thing, right? That the lighting or what your brain assumes is the lighting can determine what it sees, right? So it's about expectation and all these other things. So, right, we might think that certain people are maybe primed to observe an event and think this is the most likely explanation for that, right? Based on whatever their background experience is. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? What else would you guys, what other process of elimination would you go through? Yeah, the idea is like, okay, I would want to verify, like, okay, did you see what I just saw? Right? Like, I'm not sure if I saw it, so I would like some validation from someone else. Yeah, we often like that to get that validation, right? You need to see this too. Make sure I'm not crazy, right? Anything else? Anything else anyone else would do? Oh,
Like,
good.
well, like if there was person float.
Good. So is the experience maybe not repeatable, but is it long enough for you to, critically engage with it, right? To do some of that checking, right? Because then you might think like, oh, right. Because like if you see something really quickly, it's more likely that you could have been mistaken. But when you have a longer time that you can look at something, right, your brain is able to process more and more of that information. So yeah, if I'm able to see this thing for a longer period of time, that's going to give me more reason to think it's true, right? Than if I only saw it for a brief period of time. Good. Good. So again, now then, take that principle and apply it to then our testimony of miracles, right? That's what Hume is going to say. We're always going to be looking for those things. And he wants us to apply the same criteria we use for judging our experience, right? Also when judging the testimony of others. Right? Can we proportion our belief to the evidence? Okay, so I'll hang out for the next few minutes, but otherwise, I will see you all on Tuesday, where I'm sorry, we're going to be talking more about children facing evil. The problem of evil, the big kahuna, right? Why would an all good, all powerful, all knowing God allow not just any evil to occur, but specifically what appears like unnecessary evil? Right? There seems to be an excess of evil in the world, right? Why so much, we might say, even if some is necessary. Why so much evil, God? All right, so enjoy pondering that. I'm sorry, we'll try to look at some potential resolutions next week as well. All right, have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you.